Hola chicos! By the end of this video, you should be able to conjugate verbs into the -to command form. -to commands are used to tell someone not to do something. For example, don't dance, don't eat the worm, don't turn in your homework yet. Those are all examples of -to commands in English. We talked about how to form affirmative to commands last week. This week, we're going to talk about how to form -to commands. They're formed a little bit differently than affirmative to commands. The first thing we're going to do is conjugate our verb into the present tensio form. Then we will drop our O and add the opposite ending. This means that if you have an ER or IR verb, you are going to drop the O and add AS to the end of your command. If you have an AR verb, you are going to drop the O and add ES to the end of your command. Let's go through a few examples together. Like hablar. Hablar is an AR verb. We are going to drop our O. We have to include a no before all of these commands because they're negative. So we'll drop our O, and we will attach the opposite ending. So we get no hables. Because hablar is an AR verb, we're going to use the ES ending. Same with guardar. We put it to guardo. Then we attach the opposite to form ending, and we get no guardes. Prender, which is an ER verb, is going to follow this rule. ER verbs use AS as their ending. So we'll drop our O, and we would get no prendas. Vuelvo, Vuelvo is a stem changer. Got to keep that in mind. We will keep the stem change just like we do with affirmative to commands. Drop our O, and add the opposite ending, so we get no vuelvas. Lastly, we have pedir, which is also a stem change. We will drop our O and add the opposite ending, which is pidas. Again, in order to form -to commands, we first put our verb into the present tensio form, then we will drop our O, and then we will add the opposite to form ending. For ER and IR verbs, we will use as, and for AR verbs, we will use es. Now, way before we even started talking about commands, you guys started to learn irregular present tense verbs. And I'm sure now you can see why we were learning irregular present tense verbs. Because when we are dealing with -to commands, if there's a verb that has an irregular yo form in the present tense, we are going to maintain that same irregularity to form their -to command. So if we have tener, tener is an E to IE wannabe. The yo form becomes tengo. When we form our -to command by dropping our O and adding the opposite ending, we are going to keep that same irregularity. So tener becomes no tengas in the -to command. Ponerse is a go verb. The yo form is me pongo. To form the -to command, again, just drop the O and add our opposite ending. So it would be no te pongas. It is extremely important that you remember those irregular yo forms and you know what verbs they belong to. Because again, if you have an irregular yo form in the present tense, you keep that same irregularity in the -to command. Try these out on your own. In addition to remembering our irregular yo form, we also have to think back to the preterite tense. Okay, think back to when we learned the preterite all the way back in September and October. We talked about 3 very special types of verbs, and these verbs have a spelling change that only ever happens in the yo form. What kinds of verbs have a spelling change that only ever happen in the yo form? I'll give you a hint. Sacar, apagar, and almorzar are examples of some of these verbs. What kind of verb do you think I'm talking about? If you said car, gar, and sar verbs, you are 100% correct. We're going to keep a similar spelling change in the -2 command. But since we're using a -2 command, we're going to add an S to their endings. So sacar would be sake in the preterite. Its command becomes no sakes. So we add an S and we drop the accent. Apagar would be apage with an accent. When we form the -2 command, we're going to drop the accent and add an S. So it becomes no apagues. Almorzar is a little bit tricky because we have to remember that almorzar is an O to UE stem change. So we're actually going to keep this stem change when we form our -2 command. So we would get no almuerces. Okay? You have to remember the changes that happen to car-gar-sar verbs. So car verbs in their -2 command are going to add case. Gar verbs are going to add gaze. And sar verbs are going to add ses. And no accents on any of them. Try these car-gar-sar verbs on your own. Okay, one last thing to talk about. I know we've talked about a lot of different rules and exceptions for forming -2 commands, but just like pretty much everything in Spanish, we do have to talk about the irregulars. There are 5 of them. Only 5, and you have to memorize them. No way around it. It's just easier to memorize them and recognize them as irregulars. The first one is dar. Dar becomes no des. Estar is our next one, which becomes no estés with an accent. Ir becomes no vayas. Saber becomes no sepas. And ser becomes no seas. Those are our 5 irregular -2 commands. Dar becomes no des. Estar becomes no estés. Ir becomes no vayas. Saber no sepas. Ser no seas. Now, I want you to try a couple on your own. This is going to be a mix of regular verbs, irregular verbs, and car-gar-sar verbs. Try a few on your own. So, to wrap things up, let's remember to form -2 commands. First thing we're going to do is put our verb into the present tense yo form. Then drop our O. And then add the opposite ending. Remember that for ER-IR verbs, this means that we will add as. And for AR verbs, we will add ace. Couple of things you have to look out for when you're forming these verbs. We have to look out for verbs that have an irregular yo form. We have to keep in mind what happens to car, gar, and sar verbs. And lastly, we just have to look out for those 5 irregular -2 command forms. And there you have it. That is how you form -2 commands. You should be able to do this all by yourself for class tomorrow. Adios!